30-year mortgage rates in the United States are now the highest they've been since December of 2000, a full 5% higher than they were in December of 2020. And that, combined with the fact, when adjusted for inflation, US housing prices are now higher than they were prior to the 2008 financial meltdown, has many believing that there is a coming real estate crash. In fact, many are suggesting that it could be the biggest real estate crash in history. And can you really blame them? When you compare prices that are inflation adjusted and they end up being higher than they were at the single worst time in history to own a home, it seems pretty reasonable to draw comparisons to that time. High prices, high interest rates, that should lead to a market crash. But that's only if you hold all else equal. And in economics, you can never hold all else equal, because there are always other variables that will come into play. And while the future for American real estate is definitely looking bleak, and while there is cause for concern, and I mean real cause for concern based on those two variables, we can't just make the assumption that we're in the exact same place. And on top of that, we need to make sure that we understand the risks and how to prepare ourselves in case there is a market meltdown. Oh, and the risks, whether it was 2008 or today or any time in history, are pretty much all the same. And subsequently, so are the ways that you can protect yourself. But I'll get to that a little bit later on in the video. But before we do that, let's start by talking about what's going on in the US real estate market, how it's different from 2008, and the new and equally as scary things that we are facing in this real estate market. But before I get into the big differences, do me a favor. At the end of this video, if you find it useful, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people can see this video. It really helps me with the channel, and I appreciate every single person that does it. Okay, so here's the big question. What was different in 2008 and today? And I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos on this subject, and there's a lot of channels suggesting that pretty much everything's identical, including lending practices and all the things that led to that 2008 financial meltdown. And as somebody who's trained in economics, I can tell you that that is not the case. Are there things to be concerned about? Absolutely, but they're not the same things from 2008. I mean, let's start with one of the biggest differences. Lending practices, no matter what anybody tells you, are nowhere close to the same as they were leading up to the financial crisis. You can't just walk into a bank, fog a mirror, and get a mortgage. That's not the way it works anymore. And let's be clear, the 2008 financial meltdown was caused primarily by the fact that there were loose lending practices, and that has largely been fixed over the last 15 years. Now, are there certain programs that have been opened up to help with affordability? Yes, but they aren't the same sort of subprime lending that happened back then. So if loose lending practices isn't the cause of the run-up in prices, then what is? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to look at total households and the fact that consistently over the last 70 years, over the last 100 years, over the last 1,000 years, there's been more and more households created every single year. And this is a consistently increasing number. In fact, there's very rarely big spikes or big dips in the number of new households that are formed at any given time. New household growth in general is pretty linear. However, that being said, unlike new household formation, new home construction is not something that goes up at the same pace at all times. In fact, if you look at just after 2008, new home construction declined quite substantially. The reason why was because obviously home builders didn't want to go and build in a time where they weren't able to sell the product for what it cost to build it. And these types of dips happen all the time, especially during recessions. And subsequently, household formation tends to outpace new home construction for this very reason. Every single time we have a dip in new home construction, we're essentially falling behind what we need in order to build to keep up with the pace of household formation. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. In fact, this is the primary difference between 2008 and today, and why there seems to be this floor on housing prices when a 5% increase in interest rates should essentially bring down housing prices by about 50%. Yes, that's right, I'm bringing back the 1%, 10% rule, which is for every 1% increase in interest rates, you should see a 10% reduction in housing prices, or at least a 10% headwind in the ability for home prices to maintain themselves. So then why, when interest rates are putting 50% downward pressure on housing prices, are we not seeing housing prices collapse? Well, that's thanks to something that didn't exist in 2008. And that is the fact that there are now 3 generations and almost 4 generations competing for the current housing supply. So we all know that the baby boomer generation was the biggest generation prior to the millennials. And back in 2008, the first of the millennials, those born in 1981, were just starting to get into the housing market. Fast forward 15 years, and now pretty much all millennials are starting to enter the housing market in some way, shape, or form, whether that is renting or buying. And on top of that, we're starting to see the first few Generation Z buyers enter the market as well, which means we now have baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z all competing for the same housing stock. And by the way, that housing stock has not been built to withstand the amount of demand that is coming from essentially 4 generations now competing for real estate. And on top of that, thanks to increased life expectancy, the number of boomers that are giving up their homes is declining as well. And ironically, nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw the fact that we're going to have a whole bunch of millennials forming families, then we're going to have a whole bunch of Generation Z forming families, and eventually at some point, we're going to end up in a situation where we don't have enough housing supply. Now, coincidentally, that happened around the same time as the pandemic, which led to the lowest interest rates we have ever seen, which caused a significant amount of buyers who probably would have bought a little bit later on to move into the market quickly, pushing the demand that would have been 3 to 5 years down the road all into 2021 and 2022, which is why this support level for the US housing prices, even when inflation adjusted, has remained even in the face of higher interest rates. This run up in price was always going to be there. It just happened significantly faster than it should have. And as you can see, this very clearly led to a shift in the number of 25 to 34-year-olds that were heading a household. So in other words, the number of 25 to 34-year-olds that were responsible for making the payments. So if you take the pandemic out of play, you take the lower interest rates out of play, and you take the fact that people just got tired of living with their parents so quickly when they were bound to live in that home during lockdowns, then we find ourselves in a situation where there's obviously going to be more activity in the real estate market and subsequently higher prices. And there's nothing to suggest that the support in the market won't remain, at least barring some unforeseen circumstance that causes the economy to collapse again. Now, that being said, we can't ignore the fact that that is a possibility, because there is the possibility that higher interest rates will lead to significant unemployment, and significant unemployment could lead to a housing market crash. When you have people that can't pay their bills, that causes houses to get foreclosed upon, and that could potentially lead to lower prices in the future. But the risk here is the same as it was in 2008, and the same as it has been throughout history. And subsequently, the ways to mitigate that risk are also the same. There's 4 primary risks at any point in time, like today, where it seems like there's a possibility that this could all come crashing down. The first is the risk of losing your job. The second then becomes the risk of losing your home. The third becomes the risk of not being able to feed your family. And the fourth, for those who have investments and retirement savings, is losing a significant amount of your net worth. And when you think about all the videos on the internet right now saying that we are headed for a recession and the worst financial crisis in history, well, that would have most people worried. But there's some really simple ways to make it so that you don't have to worry about what's happening in the economy, so that you can ignore all the news headlines and all of the if it bleeds, it leads story titles. And they're really simple. It's all about knowing that you have a backup plan so that those things don't bother you if they were to happen. So let's start by talking about the risk of losing your job. This is really simple. There's 2 things you can do to make sure that you don't find yourself in a position where you don't have a job and therefore don't have money to be able to feed your family or keep your home. If you are employed, make yourself so valuable to your employer that they cannot risk losing you, even if they have to do job layoffs. And the way that you do this is by both working harder and, more importantly, by improving your skill set, by getting better at your job and creating your potential to earn more in the future. I'm going to tell you right now, the best place to do that for free is YouTube. You can Google anything you want to learn how to do better, and there will be a video to teach you exactly how to do it. Now, the second thing you need to do is to make sure you protect yourself from losing the roof over your head. Now, this is a priority over being able to feed your family, because if you know the rule of 3 for survival, you know that the first and most important thing that you need is shelter. The second thing is water, and the third is food. So always make sure that you put having a place to live ahead of all else. And the way that you ensure that is first by having at least 3 to 6 months worth of rent or mortgage payments, depending on your situation, in a bank account, in a savings account that is protected from financial loss. So in other words, don't go and let it ride on black at the casino or put it all on the S&P 500, because if that declines, you could lose a significant amount of that money. And by having that 3 to 6 months worth of backup funds, you know that you've always got a place to live. There's no worry about losing your house there, assuming that you can find a new job in the next 3 to 6 months. Now, if you are a single income family, you need to try to get at least 6 months worth of savings If you are a dual income family, you can probably get away with 3, but the more you can save, obviously, the better. Next is making sure that you can always feed your family. And this is where being a little bit strategic, a little bit smart, and a little bit ahead of everybody else is really important. Every family in America right now, especially those living paycheck to paycheck, should do their best to have at least 3 to 6 months worth of non-perishable food items and water available for if they needed it. And there's 2 scenarios where this comes in handy. For example, times like during the pandemic where everybody was trying to get food and toilet paper and all of those things, if you had 3 to 6 months worth stored in your basement or in a pantry somewhere, you would have been just fine and you wouldn't have had to deal with all the chaos. The second is in the event of a job loss. If you have 3 to 6 months worth of food, you know that you've got 3 to 6 months of food stored up and you don't have to worry about being able to eat. And most importantly, how you build this supply of 3 to 6 months worth of non-perishable food is by buying it when it is on sale. You stock up on the things that are at the steepest discount on every single grocery trip. You put it aside, and once you have stock in your pantry items of the staples, well, then you rotate out the old stuff for the new stuff that you buy on your regular grocery trips going forward. And I'm talking about things like pasta, canned goods, and the like. And as an added bonus, if there's ever a natural disaster that happens, hey, you got all those things on hand. But the bonus on top of all that is you're only ever buying things when they are on sale at the grocery store. Because you've got a ready supply at home, you'll never need to pay full price for groceries ever again, with the exception of the perishable stuff, of course. And then last but not least, if you do have investments, if you have savings and they are invested in the stock market, you want to make sure that you are in a diversified portfolio. And this is the type of portfolio like the Ray Dalio All-Weather Fund that keeps a pretty significant amount of your investments in things like bonds and cash. And in the event that the stock market does collapse, you will be protected from a significant loss in your investments. And you'll be able to go in and buy back in at cheaper prices and give yourself an actual opportunity to earn more money during that recession and use it to your benefit. And really, everything you need to do to mitigate your risks of that financial meltdown, of that housing crisis, is that simple. It's improve your skills. It's make sure you have enough money to keep your home. It's make sure that you have enough food to protect yourself for 3 to 6 months in the event that you lose your job or there is a natural disaster. And make sure that you're always buying everything on sale. And then make sure your investment portfolio is completely and 100% diversified so that if there is a stock market crash, you don't find yourself in a situation where you gave back half of your money to the market. And I cannot reiterate enough that this isn't about whether there's going to be a housing market crash or not. Nobody can predict that. This is about making sure that you mitigate the risks. The risks are simple, and so is the mitigation. Oh, and if you want to see another video on 100 money hacks that could help you, especially leading up to a recession or during a recession, make sure you check out this video right here.